Hello and welcome back to World 360. How is the situation in Sudan going from bad to worse? Why did Belgium summon the UAE ambassador? And what could Uzbekistan's snap election mean for Russia and Central Asia? We answer all this and more in today's episode. So first up, Sudan. It seems the violence in Sudan between the army and paramilitary forces has fallen off the radar of world news. Countries including India made great efforts to evacuate their citizens from the war-torn African country in May, but have we kept track of what has happened since then? Let me bring you up to date. At least 3,000 people have been killed and 6,000 wounded in the conflict. Fighting between the Sudanese army and a rebel group known as the Rapid Support Forces or the RSF continues. Ceasefires have also not held up. Not to mention, the fighting saw the deadliest air raid to date just very recently. On Sunday, in fact, an airstrike ordered by the Sudanese army killed 22 people in Khartoum. Now, Khartoum is the capital of Sudan and therefore fighting is very intense there as both sides battle for control over the city. And now this battle is threatening to escalate into a full-blown civil war, according to the UN. Shortly after the latest airstrike, the deputy spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, Farhan Haq, said in a statement that the current situation could push Sudan to the brink of a full-scale civil war. Haq also called on the African Union to coordinate efforts to find a solution to the conflict. If you recall, in 2019, it was the African Union that successfully mediated in Sudan after the military overthrew President Omar al-Bashir. Since then, the country's transition into a civilian-led democracy has been slow and bumpy, to say the least. In light of recent events, the African Union has suspended Sudan from the grouping but still maintains support for its eventual, or rather hopeful, democratic transformation. Now, this is going to be a tightrope walk. The African Union needs to take strict action against the forces of power in Sudan while also not isolating the country from the rest of the continent. This is because the situation in Sudan could very well destabilize the region, especially the Sahel belt of Africa, which has seen many countries face security crises and militancy. Let's not forget that Sudan, Africa's third largest country in terms of land area, shares borders with several countries in an already unstable region. Now, some of these neighbors include Egypt, Libya, Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. In April, in fact, we did an episode where we explained how the violence in Sudan has affected its neighbors, which you can check out again. Now, many of these countries are taking in large numbers of Sudanese refugees, and many of these countries have themselves faced or are facing insurgencies, threat of Islamist militants, and other forms of crises. But some suspect the crisis in Sudan could majorly affect countries further away, like Russia, which has for years been keen to build a naval base in Port Sudan. John Mukum Mbaku, professor at Weber State University in Utah in the US, writes how the conflict could also jeopardize trade between Sudan and Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, especially Sudanese exports of oil and gold. Not to mention, Sudan is located near the Red Sea, which means the situation there could threaten trade flows through the Suez Canal, affecting much of the world's shipping. Therefore, the instability in Sudan shouldn't just worry its African neighbors, but the world as well. For our next topic, we're looking at why Belgium summoned the UAE ambassador. But before we get into it, we need to look at a report published by the European Investigative Collaborations, or the EIC, an investigative journalism project that spans many countries. So last Friday, the EIC came out with a blockbuster report called the Abu Dhabi Secrets that accused a Swiss company of spying and creating disinformation campaigns across Europe on behalf of the UAE state. According to the report, a Swiss private intelligence company called Alp Services was hired by the UAE state to spy on citizens of 18 countries in Europe and beyond. The company allegedly sent the names of more than 1,000 individuals and 400 organizations in 18 European countries, labeling them as part of the Muslim Brotherhood network in Europe. Emirati intelligence services allegedly paid at least 5.7 million euros to this Swiss company for this task. Now, I mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood, but what is it? The Muslim Brotherhood is the oldest political Islamist group in the Arab world that was first founded in Egypt in the 1920s. But since then, it has gained a tainted reputation in modern political history after it was banned in certain countries and endorsed an armed struggle as part of its ideology. Egypt has labeled the group a terrorist organization, as has Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The group is believed to operate underground now, especially after current Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's marked distaste for them. Since becoming president in 2014, Sisi has repeatedly excluded the Muslim Brotherhood from national dialogue and has banned it from participating in Egyptian politics. Now back to the report by EIC. This report created quite a splash in both Europe and the Middle East, prompting the Belgian government to summon the UAE ambassador, as 80 organizations and 160 individuals listed in this expose were from Belgium. According to a report by Middle East Eye, Zakia Khattabi, Belgium's Federal Minister for Environment and Sustainability, was named in this EIC report as having links to extremism. Now, for our last subject in this episode of World 360, we're looking at Uzbekistan's election that saw autocratic President Shavkat Mirziyoyev extend his rule for 7 more years. The reason I put election in quotes is because it is widely known that elections in this Central Asian country are not fair or transparent. In fact, the election, which was actually a snap election in Uzbekistan, was called 3 years ahead of time and was part of a larger plan orchestrated by the country's president to cement his rule. Now, Mirziyoyev had called for a snap election after changing the constitution through a referendum earlier on, which allowed him to extend his presidential term by law. The 3 candidates up against him were also largely unknown and are speculated to be just stooges for an inevitable result. We've seen the same in countries like China and Belarus. But that aside, Mirziyoyev's re-election is important for the region and its closest ally, Russia. Uzbekistan, like its Central Asian neighbors, is trying to distance itself from Western sanctions imposed on Russia over the war in Ukraine. And since many Uzbeks work in Russia, the country's forex reserves have also taken a hit due to the weakening Russian ruble. In fact, the situation has put so much pressure on Uzbekistan that it has now gone from being an energy exporter to a major consumer of oil and gas, mainly from Russia. Despite being home to a significant amount of natural resources, Uzbekistan has been facing an energy crisis brought on by the Ukraine war, which peaked in January during the winter. Like its Central Asian neighbors, Uzbekistan suffered frequent power outages and began importing natural gas from Russia in January this year. Now, this was a first for Uzbek gas firm Ustrangas, which had never imported Russian gas before. Now, the energy crisis will be a major challenge for Mirziyoyev in his upcoming term, and it will be important to see if any fractures emerge in his country's bilateral relations with Russia if the issue escalates. Now, this election in Uzbekistan was also closely watched by the other Stans in the region, mainly because unlike his predecessor Karimov, who didn't really get along with other leaders in the region, Mirziyoyev has made a concerted effort since taking over power in 2016 to improve Uzbekistan's relations with its immediate neighbors. Uzbekistan's position on the world stage and in Central Asia has seen some improvements in recent years, what with major multilateral events such as the 2022 Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit taking place in its capital, Samarkand. Mirziyoyev has also been credited with bringing in certain reforms, such as eradicating forced labor in cotton fields. However, crackdowns on minorities and political rivals have continued, say experts. Thank you so much for watching. This is Pia Krishnankutty for ThePrint.